All right, welcome everybody. Perfect, good. Thank you for the thumbs up. Great to see some familiar faces in the Zoom room. Great to see everybody here in person with us. Welcome to the Center for Archival Futures First Wednesdays speaker series. Every first Wednesday during the semester, we host speakers at the cutting edge of topics in archives and digital curation, broadly conceived. And I'm so delighted to be presenting a speaker who sat across a cafe table with me every day throughout grad school, writing our dissertations at the same time. This is Dr. Andrea Thomer. She is an assistant professor at the University of Arizona School of Information, where her research focuses on the maintenance of knowledge infrastructures and scientific data curation. And she's here to talk to us today about curating longitudinal natural history data. She's also worked as an excavator at the La Brea Tar Pits. I don't know if that comes up in this talk, but you should know that about her. So welcome to Andrea, and thanks everybody for being here.
Awesome. Okay, hi everybody. Thank you for that intro, and also thank you for having me here. This is so fun to actually get to do these in-person talks again. So this is okay, so a little background on this. Well, and first I want to make sure, can you see my real screen, not just like the notes, like the speaker notes on Zoom? Okay, all right, cool. Great. Okay, so some background on this. This talk today, this is a project that is very much still ongoing. And so a lot of this talk is going to be kind of nuts and bolts about how we're wrangling data. At the end, I'm going to attempt to make some like grander statements that have profound implications or something. But a lot of this is going to be about how we are wrangling some data. So hopefully it will still be of interest to a broad audience. There we go. Okay, I work with natural history data, and I come from this background of actually working with the data and trying to wrangle that into a long-term format. So the project that I'm talking about today is about wrangling longitudinal natural history data, not necessarily from specimens, but from an actual data archive at the Institute for Fisheries Research. But this project is kind of pretty typical of a lot of similar infrastructures that are out there. There's tons of these archives there. I'm going to start by trying to provide a little bit of conceptual framework for this work. So thinking about natural history collections as knowledge infrastructures, and then go into the nuts and bolts part of this actual project. A lot of us think of natural history collections as places with awesome exhibits, and there's been a lot of fantastic scholarship on these awesome exhibits from people like Dr. Diana Marsh. Yeah, my interest has always been in the stuff behind the exhibits. There are estimation of something like 1 to 3 billion natural history specimens in the world. And so that's what some of these beautiful pictures of stuff in jars is, and jars full of seashells. The reason that it's only an estimate is because most collections are not entirely cataloged. There just are not enough people to do this work, and they've been accruing for hundreds of years. And so there's just a lot of stuff in dusty drawers at places. That scene from Indiana Jones and the Lost Ark, where they're putting the Ark of the Covenant in a giant warehouse, is not totally wrong for a lot of museum collections. But when you do get all of this digitized, when you do get it into a database, what you can start doing is showing a more global, or an aspirationally global anyway, view of biodiversity and geology across the planet. And that's what this picture in the lower right-hand corner is. It's a screenshot from GBIF, which is a big aggregator of biodiversity records, showing a heat map of where they've found specimens. I want to point out though, and this will come up again, this is aspirationally global. Natural history collections are biased in a ton of ways. First of all, they are colonial institutions, which is something I still reckon with as a person who really loves these collections and has found a lot of inspiration there personally in them, but also wants to improve the equity in our ability to work with these collections and their impacts on other people. But as you can even see in this heat map, North America and Europe are bright red, meaning that's where the most of the data has been collected, and the rest of the world, including many places that have the most biodiversity in them, are not as well documented. So this is not a panopticon. This is a very biased slice of the universe that reflects the perspectives and the priorities of the people that collected this data in the first place. So this takes me to key concept number one. I want to frame natural history collections as knowledge infrastructures. So if you're not familiar with this term, Paul Edwards, I think, is the one who's been most credited with coining this. Knowledge infrastructures are the robust networks of people, artifacts, and institutions that generate, share, and maintain specific knowledge about the human and natural world. So museums and libraries are great examples of knowledge infrastructures. For natural history museums, the people involve the curators, collection managers, researchers that work there. The artifacts are literal artifacts, so it's the many, many specimens that are in these museums. Institutions, there's over 900 natural history museums worldwide, but there's also thousands of national, state, county repositories and other kinds of data archives. And the network is the way in which they're connected, both literally and metaphorically. So whether or not it's digital or if it's just through social connections and things like that. Increasingly, there's a lot of literally networked natural history data. So over the last, I'd say 30 years, possibly a little bit longer, there have been huge pushes to get the collections, like the metadata about these specimens, into global shared databases so that everybody can access them and you can do computational science with all these records. And I'm involved in a couple of these projects now. I think CSAR is a big one, and iSamples, which stands for Internet of Samples. Happy to talk about that. We'll not go into it now. But yeah, so lots of efforts to actually put all this data online. However, and something I'd like to emphasize is that underlying this network, there are these infrastructures at risk. So a lot of the grant funding, the majority of the grant funding has been going to building these aggregators, these big online databases. Very little funding has gone to the actual collections themselves for curation of the actual materials and really the raw data that's underlying a lot of this. So that picture right there is, that's piles of field notes from the La Brea tar pits, which stay in a fireproof safe and are covered with asphalt fingerprints from all of us excavators getting them dirty over the years. For a long time, that was where that data was. There wasn't a digital copy of it. It's now, a lot of it's been transcribed at this point and it's put into the collections database. But for a lot of museums, there still is this paper-based record that's really foundational to their organization. Key concept 2 for this talk, data curation. So that's probably hopefully familiar to a lot of folks. Data curation is the work of making a data set fit for purpose and preservation ready. And I argue that it's a core, though usually under-recognized activity in natural history collections work. It's just something that collections managers have been doing fundamentally as part of their day-to-day existence. So wrangling records, making sure things have the right name. There's a ton of challenges to this. First, the data is highly heterogeneous in natural history collections. Not only do you have this huge range of physical specimens, but tons of paper records in a bunch of weird formats and tons of digital representations in a bunch of equally weird formats. Another project that I've worked on has been looking at the databases in these systems, and a lot of them are like decades old. And part of that's lack of resources. Part of it's because migration has a lot of high costs that people tend to avoid if at all possible. So heterogeneous data, a lot of it's messy. So there's massive curatorial backlogs and metadata that needs updating. Nobody has enough staff. And that means that things wind up with like wrong species names on them half the time, just because biology is not static. We change our understanding of how things are related, which means we change the scientific names of specimens a lot of times, and it's just really hard to update that. And finally, everything's really old, decades old databases with hundreds of year-old collections and with specimens that are millions, billions years old sometimes, which seems like it wouldn't necessarily be a problem, but it actually changes how you structure and model information about those specimens in databases sometimes. Okay, this is actually key concept number 3. Finally, another challenge to this data curation is that it's longitudinal data, or at least what I want to put forward as like aspirationally longitudinal data. So by longitudinal, I mean data gathered over a long period of time intended to monitor or show growth or change or evolution or some long-term phenomena. A really famous example of a longitudinal data collection project in at least our universe, there's probably the long-term ecological research network. So these ecological research stations, and that's what this map is of, that have been put all over the country to monitor ecology, collect data, the idea being that you can study change over long periods of time with this. Longitudinal studies are really foundational to a lot of natural science, but a lot of the time it's more ad hoc and it's more aspirational. It's not, people don't have the millions of billions of dollars that are necessary to maintain these research stations. So people use standards to try to collect data in a more or less interoperable way, with the hope that eventually it could be used for these bigger longitudinal studies. And in a key form of this longitudinal natural history data, and the main one that I'll be talking about today are these field notes and data archives. So these records of where stuff came from, and records of actual surveys and studies that have been done over time. Katrina, how am I on time?
About 20 minutes in, but that's with the big delay, so.
All right, okay. So next part of this talk, I'm going to talk about the Changes project, where we're trying to do this longitudinal natural history data collection. So Changes stands for Collections, Heterogeneous Data, and Next Generation Ecological Studies. Everybody in this room already heard this, but this is one of the more tortured acronyms that I've come up with. That is because we wanted to make it sound like the David Bowie song, because that makes me happy. And that's also, we have these excellent logos that were developed by our student Calibiers. So there were two parts of this project. I'm going to talk about the Michigan part of this project. So that's with Karen Aloffs as the other PI, and Hernan Lopez Fernandez, Kevin Worley at the Institute for Fisheries Research, Randy Singer, who's at the University of Michigan Museum, and Justin Schell, who has been working at was at the time working at the Shapiro Design Lab. And what we have done is come together to try to digitize a giant archive of data. So these are a bunch of pictures from data cards and people working at the archives at the Institute for Fisheries Research. And this is at the University of Michigan. Through the Department of Natural Resources at Michigan. So at the Institute for Fisheries Research, they have been doing a lot of long-term monitoring of different lakes in Michigan, looking at fish populations, thinking about how those have changed over time. And they've been collecting a ton of data and doing a bunch of treatments to those lakes over time. In theory, this should allow us to see how fish populations have changed in response to changing climate and in response to different kinds of interventions to try to improve or support certain kinds of fish populations. In practice, all of these cards are on these like basically 5x7 index cards in this giant cabinet that the student is looking through. And it takes a lot of effort to actually get the data from these cards in a way that's remotely computational. If you don't know much about fish surveys, the basics are, it's one of the fundamental things that people do is go out and count fish. How many kinds of fish and of what size. I learned through this project that there's a thing, I don't have it written down, but basically, I forget what it's called, but it's you lightly shock the fish to get them to float to the surface gently, and then you count them. And then they come back out of their little shock and go on with their day. Which is electrofishing. Yeah. So I love these projects for this. But that is one of the ways that they collect this data, you have to count the fish somehow. And this is actually less traumatic than catching them with a net in a lot of ways, or at least from what I've read. Okay, so there's some serious obstacles to computation with this archive. So first of all, there's just a lot of paper. It's just so much stuff. And if anybody's worked on a digitization project, you know that always takes longer to scan than you think it should. This is where I want to shout out to our undergrad research assistant, Kartik Tarwani, who scanned about 15,000 cards at home during the COVID lockdowns. We got him a scanner to take home, and he picked up archival boxes and churned through it, because I think this project would have totally stalled out with the shutdowns if we hadn't been able to do that. We have about 151,000 images in total, representing 70 to 75,000 cards and over 5,000 lakes in Michigan. The other challenge, though, and this has become the more persistent challenge, is that data cards are structured for humans and not computers. They are structured. They look as if they have these appealing like fields and attributes in them that should fit so nicely into a spreadsheet. And in reality, they change over time. People do not fill them out in as structured a way as you would like. And there's also just a ton of different kinds of cards. So different workflows are needed to transcribe those cards over time. So here's an example of this. One of the main kind of card, kind of like the primary key in database speak, that we started with digitizing what are called summary cards. And these summarize what's going on in a lake. So here's the front of a card. Most of the cards are two-sided. You'll see that there's a lot of what I'll call, there's kind of like metadata for the card in that it has like the lake name, its location in transect range and sections a lot of the time, which is an older way of splitting up maps. There's a lot of information about just what is going on in this lake. Is there pollution? Is there stuff built up on the shore? The main bit that we're trying to get off of this is, let's see, on the back, is first of all, just seeing what species of fish are present and in what kind of abundance. And in these cards, they split these into game fish, so fish that people want to fish, forage fish, and then coarse fish and obnoxious fish. I like obnoxious fish as a designation, but that basically means like invasive ones or ones that you just don't want in the lake for a variety of reasons. So this is the basic kind of card. And again, it looks like it's kind of structured, it's structured-ish. And in theory, it is actually OCRable, but it's hard to actually pull the data into discrete fields from OCR data. So transcription is really the best option. So this is a summary card. There are also, this is a growth card. So this has more detailed information about the size and age of fish that have been found in a survey. In this case, some bluegills. And again, this card could be potentially OCR'd, even with the like the grid here. I learned, which I did not realize was actually possible, that a lot of OCR now actually can capture tables in a much more effective way than I thought possible when I first started doing this kind of work 10 years ago. Yeah, so this is a growth card that could be potentially OCR'd. This one starts, this is where you start to see things getting a little trickier, and this is our current challenge. So this is a management card. It describes the history of recommendations and management practices at a particular lake at a particular time. And on the left-hand column, we have recommendations. On the right-hand column, there's a record of management practices and results. They're numbered, and in theory, those numbers should correspond with recommendation and what got done. Okay, so here's the OCR of this. First thing I want to point out is that I had to add these numbers at the bottom because even though this was pretty good OCR, it missed this most important bit of data, which was what number is the recommendation. That's the first bit that's absolutely crucial for tying this back together. But the second thing is that even though this is a table, it got filled out in a really weird way. So first we have 1 and 1 matching up pretty nicely in the first row. Managed for species present, and then the response was stocked annually with adult book trout in fall by LRA in 1960. Recommendation 2 gets a little weird though, immediately. We have 1 recommendation on the left and then 2 responses to that spaced apart for reasons unknown in the response column. Moving on to the next recommendation, we then go from 2 to 1A, managed for brook trout. There's no response to that. 3, there's no response to that. 4, we have 2 recommendations for 4 that are now interspersed among the other ones. Again, we have a weird numbering of where 2A is down at the bottom, and again, interspersed with the other results. And then finally, we get back to something that makes a little more sense, where these recommendations line up. And finally, we find that this lake was designated as a trout lake for whatever that means. So I wanted to color code this to try to illustrate that it's a table, but it's not machine readable. And that's not even the fault of the OCR. It's just that because human idiosyncrasy fills out records strangely sometimes. I didn't even look for a particularly weird record when I was looking for this one. I just wanted one that I could demonstrate. And then upon staring at it a little further, I found out, oh, this is a little strange. So this is the current thing that we're trying to wade through right now. Anyway, and then finally, some of the cards are structured and could be OCR'd, but they're not quite structured enough because, like, again, a person can tell that this data has spilled out of a cell, and that's meant to all be a sentence, but there's not an easy way for a computer to know to munge all of that together. So a lot of review by hand is still necessary, regardless of what we wind up doing with this. So data curation phase one, the attempt to get these cards into something approaching machine readable, approaching computational, we went to community science. I'm not actually going to spend as much time talking about this part of it because there's a lot of talks on how to build Zooniverse workflows and things like that. I'll spend a little bit of time, but I do want to first make sure to define community science. So we need help making these cards machine readable. Community science is the collection and analysis of data relating to the natural world by members of the general public, typically as part of a collaborative project with professional scientists. In this case, they're helping us curate data, basically. There's some really famous examples of this. The backyard bird count, if you've ever done that, is a great one, where people go out and count the birds in their backyards, and this contributes to understanding bird migrations and changing populations over time. A really famous one using the platform that we wound up using, Zooniverse, is the Galaxy Zoo, where volunteers are asked to help classify galaxies based on their shape. This one's probably the most famous one, both because it's a really cool project, but because there were a ton of scientific papers that came out of this, which is why it's very appealing to people like me. We see this, oh, there were great results. A lot of people probably got tenure off this. Yeah, so Galaxy Zoo was the first project on the Zooniverse platform. Zooniverse now is this big platform where basically anyone can actually set up their own citizen science project. You need to work with them to get featured on their page, but I even use it just in teaching. I have my students make their own little projects on there to learn how to do this kind of workflow stuff. So really anybody can set something up there. Excuse me. So I think I'm actually going to go first to this. So this is one shot of our very complex Zooniverse workflows. So basically you have a scan of the card up here. Volunteers are asked to transcribe certain things, and that gets put into this data entry form here. That's the core of it. But because our data is so complicated, we have had to set up a bunch of different Zooniverse workflows. So at first, and this is a very simplified workflow of our workflows, basically. So first, our students manually sort our cards by their lake and type while they're doing the scanning. Then basically all cards go through what's called the basic workflow, where we collect core metadata about each card. So they're the location of the lake, dates, any names that were on the card. Cards are then split into a range of different workflows depending on the card type and sometimes even the species. So we have growth workflows for different kinds of fish collection workflows, and this all is changing based on what we are trying to prioritize in the study and also the kind of data that we're trying to collect for each card. I'm not going to do that. So this project is a little film. I'll play it while I'm talking. So here's just like a screen capture of the whole workflow of going through and actually adding data into Zooniverse. We have all these tutorials. It's meant to be approachable by anybody who doesn't have background in fisheries science or in data curation. The project, by and large, has been successful in that we are mostly done. We are done with the public workflows. We still have some internal ones where we're still transcribing some data. So this part of it, this basic part of just getting the data into a typed format as opposed to JPEGs or PDFs is largely done. And however, this takes us to data curation phase 2, which is wrangling all this data. There are a couple of different versions of this talk that I could give, which I was telling Victoria earlier. And I'm calling this wrangling the aspirational longitudinal, trying to get stuff into what is kind of a longitudinal data set. There's both the data, but also the metadata that needs wrangling. And this is because we were, this is my first time at least running one of these projects, still learning what we need to do throughout. We realized, perhaps later than would have been ideal, that we were losing track of our metadata. We did not have great records of what every card was, what card was associated with what lake, and so on. So what I'm going to talk about is mostly the efforts to wrangle that metadata and get a sense of what is our collection, going back to that fundamental problem that so many natural history collections are, like what's our catalog in the first place? Caitlin King, the postdoc who's been working on this project, her version of the talk would be focusing on the data itself, but I'm going to mostly focus on the metadata. Yeah, so we've had to do some unexpected metadata wrangling. So creating a reliable catalog for these cards has been harder than expected. Some to honestly, as a digital curation professor, I probably should have pushed harder or like thought more about this, but we embedded a lot of metadata in file names and folder structures. And I hear the, yeah, this is the thing. Yeah, it makes a ton of sense for managing things day to day. However, when you have multiple students working on a project, of course, naming conventions are going to shift. Even with the best of intentions, when people are working really hard, it just happens. That's just what happens with stuff. So wrangling this has been harder than expected for a lot of reasons. In the future, we're planning already more projects like this. We want to create and update a metadata base basically over the course of the project. I think it's honestly, because it's necessary for the day-to-day like file management, keeping file names in, or keeping names in file names and in folder structures makes a lot of sense. But it's important to harvest that periodically and do quality checks, which we did not do. I also blame the pandemic for some of this too. So, but through this, we realized, and again, I feel like this is something I should have realized as a digital curation professor, but like metadata creation needs to be a goal as much as data creation if you actually want to create a long-lived collection. One of my efforts for a while has been wrangling this metadata to get a better sense of just what is this collection overall. So we're at the point where we can kind of, we have some fairly concrete statements about how much data we have of what type to make. So these are image counts by card type. I want to emphasize that it's images, not documents, because some of them are two-sided and some of them are multiple pages. So fish see, it looks like we have a ton of these documents, but it's that many of them are many pages long. And so there's some additional wrangling to be done to figure out what's the document number. Basic stats, we've got 87,000 files representing about, this looks like a very precise number, but, and these numbers are a little bit old, I think as of November, but representing 48,000 documents. We have 5,218 unique lake strings, which might not actually be unique lakes, because, and I'll show that in a second. Yeah. And then 101 counties. However, there are only 80 counties currently in Michigan. I've since cleaned these up and we are back to 80 counties being represented. But here's a nice, just like a histogram of the distribution of cards by county. There is some actual like tail off at some smaller counties. And I think it'll be interesting to dig into why is Schoolcraft so studied. There is definitely a lot of noise in here because of the fish seed card. So this is by number of images, not by number of documents. However, at the end, we do have the long tail of errors. So these are most of the time lake names that got put into the county column based on my cleaning workflow. This has been fixed. But I still wanted to show it because this is something that we've had to wrangle a lot. And that's also why doing these very basic visualizations has been really helpful. Here's another one. This is images per lake. Again, we have some that have just a ton of data associated with them. And again, some of that might be because it's fish seed cards with a lot of pages. But yeah, again, we have this long tail of probable errors. This one we're still digging through. But you can see a little bit. There are lakes called Charlevoix 134. And these are cases where metadata got munched together as I was trying to extract it from the file names, and now we have to go through and clean it again. We've been using OpenRefine to do a lot of this cleaning. So Charlevoix 10 through 138, these are all records of Charlevoix Lake in Charlevoix County. And so OpenRefine has been great for doing this kind of resolution. This screenshot of all of the Bass Lakes, most of these are the same lake. But another thing we've had to navigate is that often lakes have the same name in different counties. Lots of little lakes, or so we've had to go through and check this against location data, which is still ongoing. What time is it?
So there are 20 minutes left in the hour.
Okay. We've also started to plot looking at the distribution of documents per year. So these are still numbers that I want to double check. But this is a very long-lived collection. I think I forgot to say this. It dates back to the earliest date is 1886 here. So they've been collecting this fish data for over 100 years. We wanted to plot, or I wanted to plot this at least, just to see how does the data change over time? How longitudinal is the data? How evenly distributed are the kinds of data? And you'll see that it's actually interestingly patchy, I would call it. So we do have some pretty consistent, like I said that earlier, that these summary cards are kind of like something that are taken over time repeatedly of the same lake. You do see those popping up regularly every year, but you also see cards kind of come in and out of vogue, depending on the priorities of the Institute for Fisheries Research. So exam cards in the 1930s, and then more growth cards in the 50s and 60s. And then, let's see, or fish sea cards in 50s and 60s, and then growth cards in the 80s and 90s. Again, this is still kind of preliminary. I want to make sure that I'm not accidentally munging stuff together. But the other thing we noticed is that there's some ebbs and flows with historical events as well. So we started wondering, can we see World War I here, where there's just no data collected in the teens and 20s? Can you see World War II a little bit in the or the Great Depression or things like that? There's these big dips in the 30s. Boom years in the 50s. I wonder, which made me wonder if there's that might be too late for works progress or WPA projects, but I don't know. I wonder, there must be some, I wonder if there's political things going on there that led to increased funding. And then it died in the 90s. So yeah, we know as archival scholars that archives are always records of administration as much as they are of anything else. What I've been thinking about is how this is a record of, it is a record of administration of lakes that is also doubling as a scientific record in some ways. And the two things are really inextricably combined. What we want to do next with this is, and this is Kevin Worley really at the Institute for Fisheries Research, we've been talking about writing up a history of fish management based on these cards. And so I think that's something I'm really excited about doing, thinking about this data history as well as like the history of the actual organization. So like I said, there's another version of this talk focusing on the challenges of working with Zooniverse output, which is, and I say that, I don't mean that to be like a criticism of Zooniverse, but Victoria and I have been talking about this a little bit. There is a lot of kind of like insider knowledge about what the data that comes out of Zooniverse looks like, and all of the work that you have to do in order to kind of get that into a scientifically computable and usable format. This work is still ongoing. What this here is a screenshot of some of Caitlin King's code, that she uses to clean up the data sets that come out of Zooniverse. And a lot of it's things like substituting punctuation, trying to normalize punctuation, but there's also more sophisticated things like checking for other, like reconciling dates against other cards and stuff like that. So this process of realizing longitudinality, I think my main point is that it takes more than just the Zooniverse project, and it's something that's going to be ongoing for at least another year, I would say. But something I've been thinking about, this archive was useful even before it was computationally longitudinal, and that's something I don't want to lose sight of. Natural and other scientists are sometimes criticized, largely in STS literature, as being in pursuit of a view from nowhere. And I said a panopticon, like trying to catalog the world. And sometimes while working on projects like this, I wonder, like, am I doing this? Trying to like naively see everything. But I think that this archive and similar archives complicate that interpretation in some ways that I think are kind of cool and interesting. This archive has been used for stewardship and care, even without being this God's eye view, this longitudinal archive. People physically go in and use these data cards to see what's been done at a lake. And it is this very localized memory that is important for, it's a different view of natural history, and one that it's one that reflects practice that isn't always observed by STS scholars, I think. We are definitely trying to do some God's eye view sorts of stuff. So this is a screenshot of figures from a paper that Caitlin is leading, and I cannot explain well. I'm going to just doing hindcasting, basically looking at can we use this data to kind of reconstruct past populations. So that is definitely trying to attempt like a God's eye view, like a lot of climate science. But like I said, one of the things we want to do is like work on a history of just the curation, the stewardship at these sites at a more local level. I have a lot more slides, but I'm going to kind of move to wrapping up because I want to have time to talk. But in progress, we're trying to come up with data curation recipes to help guide people doing similar work. So there's just some, I don't think it's going to be as easy as here's a bunch of scripts that you can just use on anything. But I think calling out the specific kinds of curation that we're doing is important. So stuff like cleaning and normalizing dates, cleaning and normalizing names, both of fish and people. Reconciling things with authority files is just like a very librarian-y sort of thing that we have to do. Our authority files are things like taxonomic names and lake names, but it's still, that's been something we've been trying to work with. And reconciliation with a data model. So thinking about munging these many cards into one kind of data model as opposed to that is computational as opposed to so scattered. I'm gonna skip this. I want to keep thinking on the nature of aspirational longitudinality. This is a term that I've now used in 2 talks. I don't know if it makes sense, but this is what I'm kind of thinking through from a information science, more critical perspective. Thinking about, how do you balance standardized data collection and the day-to-day work of collection management? That's something I saw a lot at La Brea also. And there's a book project I keep talking about wanting to get off the ground. So maybe someday I'll get to do that. But that's what I want to think about. How do you combine long and short-term thinking and standards and stuff like that. And finally, we also want to do more knowledge infrastructuring and community building with archives doing this similar sort of work. Okay. So I'm going to end there, but thank you so much. And I also want to make sure to again acknowledge my changes colleagues. So like this is such a team effort and I am one person and it absolutely would not have been possible without this group.
Thank you. Questions for Andrea? I'll watch the chat. So for those online, please feel free to pop your questions in the chat or raise your hand if you'd like to unmute and ask aloud, and I'll keep an eye on that. And otherwise, Joel's hand went flying up. So Joel, you have the first question.
So I spent a lot of my time in the information retrieval data mining world. And I'm so curious, like what is the overlap between the issues that you're thinking about and like, so I was just Googling furiously, semi-structured data is the term I think for structured-ish. And like, I'm really curious about this, like, is this a solved problem? I don't think so, but why not? And like,
thank you, Victoria.
well, so are there subsets of semi-structured data for which we have good design patterns? I guess it's a better way to think about it. And like, how does it bubble up to? I'm assuming you use off-the-shelf OCR stuff.
Yes.
But the question, right? So like, where's the knowledge edge in terms of like how do we deal with this kind of like messy data relative to like you know what may be available in sort of off-the-shelf tools? And like I'm so curious, like practically also like what's the interaction of like data science people, machine learning people with this project? This is like really juicy technical problems. I know. You know. So
that's a great question. These are a bunch of great questions. First of all, the intersection between data science and projects like this. I know that the biodiversity and museum community at large has been trying to get data scientists interested in this for a solid decade and a half now, with varying levels of success, because there's not money to be made off of this is my hypothesis. That's what I'm guessing. It's just like, I mean, this is not, it's an interesting problem, but it's not a Google problem. Like, and Google has done some like kind of outreach. Like there are people at Google that have worked with biodiversity informatics teams, but I've seen like iDigBio try to fund like a competition with like cash as a prize. And either people are not interested or there's just not enough social overlap between those communities to get the problems across. So I think that's part of it. That might have changed in the last 5 years, but I'm not as connected with that as I would like to be. I think another part of it is the semi-structured, the structured-ish data is a weirdly hard problem. So there's a lot of, I think you can mine out taxonomic names reasonably well. Like the Biodiversity Heritage Library does that. I don't know everything about their workflow, but that's what they do. There are some problems because sometimes there are taxonomic names that are like too similar. So there's a bacillus, I think, genus for a stick insect, and there's a bacillus genus for a bacteria, which is because it's a stick bacteria. And so there's stuff like that that happens. So like connecting it with the actual concept can be tricky, but those are rare edge cases usually. But so that is kind of done. We probably could do named entity recognition on dates and things, but ours are formatted, I think. I can go back 9 million slides. Actually, let's go here. Like these are not great dates in some ways. Like that's November 1978, but that's going to be a little hard to capture. And if you were to do named entity recognition on the initials, you probably could do that, but it's going to pull up a lot of noise also. So you're going to get LRA and also PFS if you're using that as a pattern. My guess also is that like it's the structured-ish part of it. Like science needs it to be really precise, and data science will get you 80, or like NLP, or like those approaches will usually get you like 80% of the way, which is not quite precise enough to do. That's my understanding, and I might be wrong, and I bet there's some computational biologists out there that are doing some really cool stuff that I don't know about. But I don't know. Does that make sense?
It makes sense.
Yeah.
And I think like I would reject the normal framing from data science that this is an automatic workflow.
Yeah.
Right. Because like Zooniverse has a ton of stuff where they experimenting with human machine sort of workflows. In crowdsourcing, like sort of like so that 80% seems right.
Yeah.
Probably too high.
Yeah, I think it might be. Yeah. Like,
yeah.
Like especially when I was at Michigan, I would talk to, there was a lot of NLP folks there. I mean, there's also a good chunk of them at Arizona too, but I haven't both of them yet. But I would sometimes try to talk to them and try to like, are you interested in this? And some of them see this as a solved enough problem. In my conversation, they see it as solved enough, but it's not that interesting. Yeah. Or it's like, it's too applied. It's not like a fancy new algorithm, so it's not going to get them tenure. So I think all the incentive structures are really weird and are not aligned to make this happen, unless you find someone who's super into fish. I think that's hard. I mean, then those people exist. Yeah. Yeah.
So I was really curious about the STS connection, and then thinking about, so you know, like ethnographies of bureaucracy, or in sort of the line of STS that looks at kind of like how basically you take all this like really messy lived experience or information out in the world and like have to constrain it into these bureaucratic documents or these kind of constrained standards. And so there's this interesting kind of thing I think you are capturing, which is like the messiness of the data and all that like long trail stuff is potentially kind of the ways that like that either individuals or the knowledge out in the world, the sort of complexity of the actual stuff out in the world are sort of coming up against the constraints of the documents that you have. So I'm wondering if there's a way, I just think it would be like really cool to sort of like, I don't know if it would be like qualitatively coding or like spending time. So, you know, a lot of your work obviously like trying to get the stuff standardized, but like at the same time to sort of spend slower time with the qualitative information that's there in that messiness and ask like, what is that? Like, what is the nature of that? And like, does that tell you anything about the like other lived or experiential knowledge or other biological knowledge that couldn't be captured by the constraints of the bureaucracy that was being created?
That's a great question. I think with these management cards, I think that could be a good place to dig into that. I forget how there's a slide on it, how many cards of these that we have. So for the management card, that's the thing.
The grad student wants to qualitatively code 12,000.
Yeah, and so that's image counts, and
Is that one undergrad busy? Because they're
I know.
pretty.
So that means there's probably about like 6,500 cards or something like that. So yeah, that's the challenge. Like, how do we do that? I guess you could sample it. I have thought about this a little bit. And part of that's also me thinking about like, am I getting to, is there a better approach to this than rather than curating every single bit of this, but instead taking a qualitative approach and looking at it that way? And I think it depends on what the goal is. Like, is it at getting those STS questions, which I think doing a qualitative approach would be better in a lot of ways. But if it's for scientific research, then we got to figure out how to quantify it somehow.
So, but you have, I mean, you just have this like amazing, you kind of have amazing data on both ends of this that you could speak in different directions.
Yeah.
Anyway, it's very cool.
Thank you.
Great talk.
Yeah, I should have said this project was supposed to be like a year long. Both because of the pandemic, but also it's just so much. Like this is like probably year 4 at this point. So yeah.
I'm actually going to interrupt with a question from the chat, which came in before The others, which is a question from Maya. I was wondering if you found that using a slightly different approach for different cards has been or would have been helpful, or was it more useful to approach them as a whole, card types? And Justin Shell, your collaborator, has offered one perspective, which is that for him, the cards were so different in how they were structured, there wasn't a single approach that would have worked for every card, even at the most basic level of date.
Yeah, and yeah, that's definitely true. And Justin did so much. He's stared at so many of these cards for so long. Although I think he only just recently got to see them in person because he was just looking at the scans. But yeah, so they were so different. I think in the future, if we were to do this again, and there is another data set on streams rather than lakes, thinking about what's the end point, what's the beginning point, and spending some more time thinking about how are we getting from one place to another, could maybe like change how we collect a little bit of the data. It could alter the workflows, but I think we'd still need different workflows for a lot of the different card types. So yeah. Yes.
So I have a question that may not have surfaced in the data you looked at, but I'm wondering what happens when the name of a place or entity changes drastically and it's not necessarily accounted for in the records. I know this has come up with folks to talk to. Diana and I have lots of conversations about this around indigenous knowledge hierarchies. How are you seeing having to navigate making a choice about which one's going to be the correct standard of what your names fall under, right?
Yeah, that's still in progress, quite honestly, because we thought when we saw 101 counties instead of 80, we were wondering if there had been county name changes, but Wikipedia revealed that there had not. So that means it's messy data. However, with the lakes, there's definitely lakes that have changed names. And so some of that we're talking to just Kevin and asking him for his kind of just expert knowledge as someone who's worked with them. But a lot of that's one of the authority files that we're reconciling against. There's it's a Humphreys table. It is a controlled vocabulary. It's a controlled list with identifiers of lakes in Michigan. And theoretically, we should be able to match them up from there. And I think that it's a good question of like, do you use the most recent one? Do you use the legacy one? Unclear. We're getting to that. Yeah. But like, the changing nature of geolocalities, like, that's fun. Yeah.
So I have a question, unless there's somebody in the chat.
There's a comment from the chat, which I'll share, which is from Paul Wester, the director of the National Agricultural Library, who says, very much appreciates your explication of the complexity in this particular collection, how it is pretty representative in all its special idiosyncratic ways. And thanks for the mention of BHL. The National Ag Library is a partner and doing good work with them in this space.
That's great. Yeah.
So I know that you have been using the Zooniverse platform for about 8-10 years, something like that, for different projects, right?
This has been my closest use of it. Yeah. So in past projects, it's been more flirting with it a little bit. Yeah.
Now that you've committed. I was just wondering how your own approaches, and this may also be a question for Justin, have changed in terms of your workflows over time. Big question.
Yeah. For me, I think, when we talked about this as a team, but when we start the stream project, being aggressive about metadata curation and keeping a catalog basically from as we go. And like I said, like thinking about, what's in the middle of point A and point B and beyond just the Zooniverse output. And I say just the Zooniverse output as if that's a simple thing, but I do think there's been a lot. I've had an easier time like thinking about how do you make the workflow, and less of an easy time finding what do you do with the data. And some of that could also be like, I need to look harder. But I suspect that a lot of it doesn't escape like the communities of practice. And so I think that would be the biggest approach. And also thinking about where the biggest change is like being more aggressive about that methodological planning. I think also like, I don't know if this is possible. I keep wanting to talk with Karen more about this. Karen Aloss is a biologist. She's the PI on this, but like, what's the minimum data you need to answer certain questions? We at first started thinking about trying to just digitize a subsection of cards. And that's why we prioritize some cards by species, because those would be like good indicator species, is my understanding. But we wound up basically scanning and transcribing everything. Is it possible to actually prioritize certain kinds of cards, certain kinds of information more aggressively? I do not know. I don't know, because some of this is like kind of like exploratory. We're seeing what we can do once we get the data. And that's also been one of the obstacles to figuring out how are you going to curate it, because sometimes we don't quite know what we're curating until you actually get everything together. You don't know how much information you have until you've transcribed it. So I don't know if that, yeah, maybe not as profound as I'd like it. But
No,
really
super
helpful.
helpful.
Yeah. No.
Other questions for Andrea? I believe we're right at the hour. So for those who are here at UMD, we get to keep Andrea for one more day before she heads back to the University of Arizona. So please do reach out, send me an email, Katrina Fenlon, an email if you'd like to grab a little bit of Andrea's time while you're here.
Yes.
Otherwise, I'll just stop us here officially, but we can stay in chat if you'd like. And we'll thank Andrea one more time for being with us today.
Thank you.